Lieutenant Sarah Martinez walked into the mess hall at Naval Base Coronado with the same quiet confidence she carried everywhere. At 5'6", with lean muscle earned through years of grueling training, she moved with the controlled grace of someone who had survived Hell Week twice and earned her trident the hard way. The cafeteria buzzed with the usual evening chatter of sailors, Marines, and support staff unwinding after another demanding day. Sarah had been stationed at Coronado for 3 months now, assigned to SEAL Team 7 after completing her specialized training. She was one of only 12 women to ever earn the coveted Navy SEAL designation, a fact that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Some embraced her presence with professional respect, understanding that she had met the same impossible standards as every other SEAL. Others viewed her as an experiment, a political statement, or worse, a weakness in their elite brotherhood. Tonight felt different from the moment she entered the mess hall. The usual ambient noise seemed forced, conversations a little too loud, laughter a little too sharp. Sarah had developed an acute sense for danger during her years in special operations, and every instinct she possessed was now quietly alerting her to trouble ahead. She moved through the serving line with practiced efficiency, selecting grilled chicken, steamed vegetables, and brown rice. Proper nutrition was critical for maintaining the physical demands of her job, and Sarah treated her body like the precision instrument it needed to be. As she turned to find a seat, she noticed a table of 4 recruits in the corner watching her with the kind of predatory attention that made her skin crawl. The recruits were clearly new to the base, their uniforms still crisp and their haircuts fresh from boot camp. They sat huddled together like a pack of hyenas, occasionally glancing her way and snickering among themselves. Sarah recognized the type immediately. Young men drunk on their own perceived toughness, looking for someone they thought they could intimidate to prove their worth. She chose a table near the window, strategically positioned so she could see most of the room while keeping her back to the wall. Old habits from deployment zones never really disappeared. The mess hall was moderately crowded with perhaps 60 people scattered across various tables, most focused on their meals and conversations with colleagues. As Sarah began eating, she noticed the recruits had gone quiet. In her peripheral vision, she could see them having what appeared to be an intense discussion, with frequent glances in her direction. One of them, a stocky kid with mean eyes and a slight swagger even while sitting down, seemed to be doing most of the talking. Sarah continued eating calmly, but every muscle in her body was now coiled and ready. The first recruit stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor with deliberate noise. He was followed by his 3 companions, and together they began moving across the mess hall toward her table. Their approach was casual, but clearly coordinated, spreading out slightly as they walked to position themselves around her chosen spot. Sarah continued eating, her expression neutral and relaxed. She had learned long ago that showing fear or anxiety only encouraged bullies and predators. Instead, she focused on her breathing, keeping it steady and controlled while mentally cataloging everything about her surroundings. The exits were clearly marked, the nearest one about 20 feet to her left. Most of the other diners seemed oblivious to the developing situation, lost in their own conversations and meals. The stocky recruit reached her table first, his 3 friends arranging themselves in a loose semicircle that effectively blocked her most direct route to the exit. Up close, Sarah could see he was probably no more than 19 or 20, with the kind of aggressive confidence that young men often displayed when they felt they had backup and a perceived advantage. Well, the stocky recruit said, his voice carrying just loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Look what we have here, boys. The famous Lady SEAL." His tone dripped with sarcasm and barely concealed contempt. The other 3 chuckled on cue, clearly feeding off their leader's energy. Sarah continued chewing her food calmly, not acknowledging their presence. She had dealt with this type of confrontation before, though usually in more subtle forms. Direct harassment was actually easier to handle than the passive-aggressive undermining she often faced from those who questioned her place in the special operations community. "I'm talking to you, sweetheart," the recruit continued, his voice taking on a harder edge when she failed to respond. "My buddies and I have been wondering what kind of special treatment you got to earn that fancy pin on your uniform. Must have been some real intensive one-on-one training, if you know what I mean." The implication in his words was clear and disgusting, suggesting that her achievements were the result of sexual favors rather than skill and dedication. Sarah felt a familiar flame of anger kindle in her chest, but she kept it carefully controlled. Emotional reactions in situations like this often led to poor decisions and escalated conflicts. She took another bite of her chicken and chewed slowly, her eyes still focused on her plate. The recruit's friends were growing bolder now, emboldened by her apparent passivity. One of them, a tall, thin kid with acne scars, leaned closer to the table. "Maybe she's deaf," he suggested with a nasty grin. "Or maybe she knows she doesn't belong here and is too scared to say anything." The comment drew more laughter from the group, though Sarah noticed it sounded forced and nervous rather than genuinely amused. The mess hall around them had begun to take notice of the confrontation. Conversations at nearby tables grew quieter as people turned to observe what was happening. Some looked concerned, others curious, and a few seemed to be enjoying the prospect of entertainment. Sarah was acutely aware that her response to this situation would be watched, analyzed, and discussed throughout the base for weeks to come. The stocky recruit placed his hands on her table and leaned down closer, his face now only a few feet from hers. She could smell the combination of cheap cologne and nervous sweat that seemed to follow aggressive young men everywhere they went. "You know what I think?" he said, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a menacing whisper. "I think you're just another diversity hire who lucked her way through training while the instructors looked the other way. I bet you couldn't last 5 minutes in a real fight with any one of us, let alone handle actual combat." Sarah finally looked up from her plate, her dark eyes meeting his with a calm intensity that made him unconsciously take a half-step backward. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but carried clearly across the now silent section of the mess hall. "You're standing in my light," she said simply, then returned her attention to her meal. The recruit's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. Being dismissed so casually in front of his friends and the watching crowd was clearly not the reaction he had expected or prepared for. His hands curled into fists at his sides as he struggled to maintain his aggressive posture while processing her complete lack of intimidation. "Oh, you think you're funny?" he snarled, his voice rising slightly. "Let me tell you something, princess. Just because some politically correct admiral decided to let you play dress-up doesn't mean you belong with real warriors. When the shooting starts, we'll see how tough you really are." Sarah set down her fork and looked up at him again, this time with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. The expression was more unsettling than any display of anger could have been, carrying with it the quiet confidence of someone who had already survived situations these recruits couldn't imagine. "When the shooting starts," she said in the same calm voice, "I hope for your sake you're better at following orders than you are at picking fights you can't finish." The challenge in her words was clear, and the recruit's face grew even redder. His 3 friends shifted nervously, suddenly aware that their intended victim wasn't reacting according to their script. The watching crowd had grown larger now, with people at tables throughout the mess hall turning to observe the confrontation. The stocky recruit looked around at his audience, clearly feeling the pressure to escalate the situation to save face. Sarah could see him weighing his options, his immature mind probably calculating whether to back down and look weak or push forward into territory he wasn't equipped to handle. She made the decision for him by standing up slowly, her movements fluid and controlled. At full height, she was actually slightly shorter than all 4 recruits. But something in her bearing and the way she carried herself made the height difference irrelevant. She moved with the unconscious confidence of a predator, and the recruits instinctively shifted backward slightly. "Gentlemen," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly across the now quiet mess hall, "you have approximately 30 seconds to return to your table and finish your meals before this situation becomes much more complicated than you intended." The recruits looked at each other uncertainly, their group dynamics suddenly shifting as doubt crept into their minds. What had started as an easy target for harassment was clearly turning into something else entirely, though none of them were experienced enough to fully understand what they had stumbled into. The stocky recruit's pride wouldn't let him back down now, not with dozens of eyes watching and his reputation among his peers hanging in the balance. He took a step closer to Sarah, close enough that she could feel his breath on her face when he spoke. "Or what?" he challenged, his voice cracking slightly despite his attempt to sound intimidating. "You gonna cry to your commanding officer? Tell him some mean recruits hurt your feelings?" Sarah's expression didn't change, but those who knew her well would have recognized the slight shift in her posture that indicated she was transitioning from defensive awareness to active readiness. Her weight settled slightly forward onto the balls of her feet, her hands relaxed at her sides, but positioned for quick movement. "I'm going to give you one more opportunity to walk away," she said quietly. "After that, the choice won't be yours anymore." The tall recruit with acne scars laughed nervously, trying to break the growing tension. "Come on, guys. Maybe we should just—" "Shut up," the stocky recruit snapped without taking his eyes off Sarah. His three friends fell silent, suddenly realizing they had allowed themselves to be drawn into something that was spiraling beyond their control. Sarah glanced at the clock on the wall. 20 seconds, she said calmly. The mess hall had fallen completely silent now. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their work to watch through the serving window. The confrontation had reached that critical point where everyone present knew something significant was about to happen, though most had no idea what form it would take. The stocky recruit's hands twitched at his sides, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid as adrenaline flooded his system. He had never been in a real fight before, despite all his tough talk and posturing. Boot camp had taught him basic combat techniques, but those had been controlled exercises with instructors and safety protocols. This was something else entirely. 10 seconds, Sarah said, her voice still perfectly calm. One of the other recruits, a pudgy kid with glasses who had been quiet through most of the confrontation, tugged on the stocky recruit's sleeve. "Dude, maybe we should just go," he whispered urgently. "This doesn't feel right." But the stocky recruit was too far committed to back down now. His young male pride and the watching crowd had backed him into a corner where retreat felt impossible. He raised his right hand and jabbed his finger toward Sarah's chest, intending to poke her in the shoulder as a dominance gesture. The movement was clumsy and telegraphed, the kind of amateur mistake that someone with Sarah's training could see coming from a mile away. Her response was so fast that most of the watching crowd missed exactly what happened. Sarah's left hand moved in a quick circular motion, redirecting the recruit's pointing finger away from her body while simultaneously trapping his wrist. Her right hand came up to control his elbow, and with a subtle shift of her weight and a precise application of pressure, she rotated his arm in a direction it wasn't designed to go. The recruit's aggressive expression instantly transformed into one of shock and pain as he found himself bent forward at an awkward angle, his arm locked in a position where any resistance would result in serious injury. Sarah had used his own momentum and poor body mechanics against him, turning his clumsy attack into a perfectly controlled joint lock. "Stay still," she advised quietly, applying just enough pressure to make her point clear without causing permanent damage. "Any sudden movements will result in a dislocated shoulder and probably a broken wrist." The recruit's three friends froze in place, suddenly realizing they were witnessing a level of skill and training that none of them were prepared to deal with. The entire confrontation had shifted from their perceived advantage to complete disadvantage in less than 2 seconds. The stocky recruit's face was now twisted with pain and humiliation, his tough guy persona completely shattered. Tears of frustration and physical discomfort leaked from the corners of his eyes as he struggled to process what had just happened to him. "Please," he whispered, his voice now stripped of all its earlier aggression. "You're hurting me." Sarah maintained the hold for another few seconds, ensuring that the lesson was thoroughly absorbed not just by him, but by his friends and everyone else watching. The mess hall remained completely silent except for the recruit's labored breathing and the distant hum of the kitchen equipment. "The next time you decide to harass someone," Sarah said in a voice loud enough for the entire room to hear, "you might want to make sure you understand who you're dealing with first." She released the hold gradually, allowing the recruit to straighten up slowly while keeping her eyes locked on his. His arm hung limply at his side as he rubbed his wrist, the fight completely gone out of him. The recruit's 3 friends looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. What had seemed like an easy opportunity to prove their toughness had turned into a public humiliation that would follow them throughout their time at the base. The pudgy kid with glasses was actually trembling slightly, clearly terrified that Sarah might turn her attention to him next. Sarah stepped back and sat down at her table, picking up her fork as if nothing unusual had happened. The recruit and his friends stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what they were supposed to do next. "I believe your table is over there," Sarah said without looking up from her meal, gesturing vaguely toward the corner where they had been sitting. The 4 recruits began backing away slowly, none of them willing to turn their backs on Sarah until they had put some distance between themselves and her table. The stocky recruit kept rubbing his wrist and shoulder, wincing with each movement as he discovered new areas of soreness from the brief but effective joint manipulation. As they retreated, the mess hall slowly began to come back to life. Conversations resumed in hushed tones as people processed what they had just witnessed. Many of the observers were clearly impressed, having never seen such a quick and clean resolution to what could have been a much uglier confrontation. A senior petty officer at a nearby table caught Sarah's eye and gave her a subtle nod of approval. Several other experienced personnel followed suit, their expressions showing professional respect for her handling of the situation. These were people who understood the delicate balance required when dealing with harassment while maintaining military discipline and avoiding unnecessary escalation. Sarah continued eating her meal calmly, though she remained alert to her surroundings. The immediate threat had passed, but she knew that word of the incident would spread quickly throughout the base. Some would view her response as appropriate and necessary, while others might see it as excessive or problematic. The 4 recruits reached their original table and sat down heavily, their earlier bravado completely deflated. They huddled together in whispered conversation, occasionally glancing nervously in Sarah's direction. The stocky recruit continued massaging his shoulder, his face a mixture of pain, embarrassment, and dawning realization of how badly he had misjudged the situation. Other diners began finishing their meals and leaving, but many made subtle detours past Sarah's table, offering quiet words of support or simply acknowledging her with respectful nods. A female Marine stopped briefly to introduce herself, expressing appreciation for Sarah's professional handling of what could have been a much worse situation. As the mess hall gradually emptied, Sarah reflected on the incident and its likely aftermath. She had responded with exactly the level of force necessary to neutralize the threat while demonstrating her capabilities to anyone who might question them in the future. The technique she had used was non-lethal but highly effective, requiring minimal effort while making a maximum impact. She finished her meal methodically, taking the time to properly fuel her body despite the disruption. Maintaining her physical condition was a critical part of her job, and she refused to let the actions of a few immature recruits interfere with her professional responsibilities. The 4 recruits left their table before finishing their own meals, clearly uncomfortable remaining in the same space as Sarah. As they passed her table on their way to the exit, the stocky recruit made brief eye contact, his expression now showing a grudging respect mixed with embarrassment. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then thought better of it and continued walking. Sarah watched them leave, then turned her attention back to her meal. She had handled the situation exactly as her training dictated, with minimal force, maximum effectiveness, and complete professionalism. The incident would become part of the base folklore, but more importantly, it would serve as a deterrent to anyone else who might consider testing her resolve or capabilities. The mess hall was now nearly empty except for the cleanup crew and a few stragglers finishing their meals. Sarah completed her dinner in peaceful silence, her appetite unaffected by the earlier confrontation. She had learned long ago that allowing external stressors to disrupt basic needs like nutrition and sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford in her line of work. As Sarah finished her meal and prepared to leave the mess hall, she noticed Commander James Mitchell entering through the main doors. Mitchell was the base executive officer, a decorated veteran with over 20 years of service who had earned his reputation through multiple combat deployments and exceptional leadership. His presence at this hour was unusual, and Sarah suspected word of the incident had already reached the command structure. Mitchell scanned the nearly empty mess hall before his eyes settled on Sarah. He approached her table with the measured stride of someone accustomed to command, his expression neutral but alert. Sarah stood as he approached, maintaining proper military courtesy despite the informal setting. "Lieutenant Martinez," Mitchell said, his voice carrying the authority that came with years of leadership experience. "I understand there was an incident here this evening." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, her posture remaining at attention. 4 recruits approached my table and initiated a confrontational situation. I de-escalated it using minimal force. Mitchell nodded slowly, his experienced eyes studying her face for any signs of defensiveness or uncertainty. He had dealt with countless disciplinary situations throughout his career and had developed an ability to read people that served him well in moments like this. "Walk me through exactly what happened," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "Take your time and give me every detail." Sarah recounted the incident methodically, describing the recruits' approach, their verbal harassment, the escalation of their behavior, and her eventual physical response. She spoke in the clear, concise manner that military training instilled, focusing on facts rather than emotions or interpretations. Mitchell listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as she described key moments in the confrontation. His expression remained neutral throughout her account, though Sarah noticed his jaw tighten slightly when she described the sexual implications in the recruit's comments. "The joint lock you applied," Mitchell said when she finished. "How much force did you use?" "Sufficient to control the situation without causing permanent injury, sir." "The technique was designed to demonstrate capability while minimizing actual harm. The recruit will likely experience soreness for a day or two, but there should be no lasting damage." Mitchell leaned back in his chair, processing the information. "I've already spoken with several witnesses who corroborate your account. The consensus is that you showed remarkable restraint given the circumstances." Sarah remained silent, understanding that Mitchell wasn't finished with his assessment of the situation. As an experienced officer, he would need to consider not just the immediate incident, but its broader implications for unit cohesion, discipline, and the ongoing integration of women into special operations roles. "However," Mitchell continued, "I need you to understand that this incident will have consequences beyond tonight. There are some in the command structure who will use this as evidence that integrating women into SEAL teams creates more problems than benefits." Sarah had expected this response. Every action she took as one of the first female SEALs was scrutinized and analyzed through the lens of broader policy debates about women in combat roles. A single incident of violence, even in self-defense, could be twisted into an argument against the entire integration program. "I understand, sir," she replied, "but I also couldn't allow the harassment to continue unchecked. Failing to respond would have sent the message that such behavior is acceptable." Mitchell nodded approvingly. "Exactly right. You were placed in an impossible situation where any response would be criticized by someone. The question is whether you chose the best available option given the circumstances." He pulled out a small notebook and reviewed some hastily scrawled notes. "I've been in contact with the recruit's company commander. Apparently, Recruit Thompson has been a disciplinary problem since arriving at the base. This isn't his first incident of inappropriate behavior, though it is by far the most serious." Sarah wasn't surprised to learn that the stocky recruit was a repeat offender. In her experience, people who harassed others rarely limited themselves to a single incident. Thompson had likely been testing boundaries and pushing limits since his arrival, growing bolder with each unchecked transgression. "What's going to happen to him and his friends?" Sarah asked. "Thompson will face a disciplinary hearing for conduct unbecoming and sexual harassment. His 3 companions will receive counseling and additional training on proper military bearing and respect for fellow service members. Their commanding officers are displeased with their behavior." Mitchell closed his notebook and looked directly at Sarah. "As for you, I want to be clear that you handled this situation exactly as you should have. You used appropriate force in response to a legitimate threat, and you demonstrated the kind of professionalism we expect from our special operations personnel." The relief Sarah felt was carefully controlled, but she appreciated Mitchell's clear support. Having the executive officer's backing would be crucial in the days ahead, as word of the incident spread throughout the base and beyond. "However," Mitchell continued, "I'm going to recommend that you attend a brief refresher course on conflict de-escalation, not because you did anything wrong, but because it will help address any criticism that might arise from this incident." Sarah understood the political maneuvering behind the recommendation. By voluntarily attending additional training, she would demonstrate continued commitment to professional development while providing cover for the command structure against allegations of inadequate oversight. "I'll arrange for the training immediately, sir," she replied. Mitchell stood to leave, then paused as if remembering something important. "One more thing, Lieutenant. I've been watching your performance since you arrived at this base, and I want you to know that you've exceeded expectations in every measurable category. Don't let tonight's incident make you doubt your place here." His words carried more weight than a dozen official commendations. Mitchell was known throughout the Navy as someone who didn't give praise lightly or engage in empty encouragement. His assessment was based on careful observation and professional judgment. "Thank you, sir," Sarah replied. "I appreciate your confidence." After Mitchell left, Sarah remained at her table for a few more minutes, processing the conversation and its implications. The immediate crisis had passed, but she knew the incident would follow her for months or even years to come. Every future assignment, evaluation, and opportunity would be viewed through the lens of that 45-second confrontation in the mess hall. She thought about the 4 recruits, particularly Thompson, and wondered what had driven them to target her specifically. Was it simple misogyny, or something deeper rooted in their own insecurities and inadequacies? The military attracted all types, including some who were drawn more to the perception of power and dominance than to the ideals of service and sacrifice. As Sarah finally left the mess hall, she passed the table where the recruits had been sitting. Someone had left behind a partially eaten hamburger and a spilled drink, evidence of their hasty departure. The sight reminded her of how quickly situations could escalate and how important it was to remain constantly aware of potential threats. Walking back to her quarters, Sarah reflected on the broader implications of her presence in the SEAL community. She had always known that being a pioneer came with additional responsibilities and scrutiny. Every success would be held up as evidence that integration was working, while every failure or controversy would be used to argue against continued progress. The evening air was cool and refreshing after the tension of the mess hall incident. Naval Base Coronado was quiet at this hour, with most personnel either completing evening duties or relaxing in their quarters. The familiar sounds of military life, distant conversations, radio chatter, the occasional vehicle, provided a comforting backdrop as Sarah made her way across the base. In her quarters, Sarah began preparing for the next day's training schedule. As a member of SEAL Team 7, her days were filled with physical conditioning, weapons training, tactical exercises, and mission planning. The incident in the mess hall would not be allowed to interfere with her professional responsibilities or her commitment to maintaining the highest standards of readiness. She laid out her gear methodically, checking each piece of equipment for proper condition and functionality. This nightly ritual served both practical and psychological purposes, ensuring she was ready for whatever challenges the next day might bring while providing a sense of control and routine that helped process the stress of her demanding career. As she settled in for the night, Sarah thought about the lessons learned from the evening's confrontation. The incident had reinforced the importance of remaining constantly alert, maintaining physical and mental readiness, and responding to threats with appropriate but controlled force. More importantly, it had demonstrated that she belonged in this elite community not despite being a woman, but because she possessed the same skills, judgment, and professionalism as her male counterparts. The 4 recruits had learned a valuable lesson about respect, consequences, and the danger of making assumptions based on appearances. Thompson, in particular, would likely carry the memory of his humiliation for years to come, hopefully using it as motivation to become a better sailor and a better person. Sarah's final thought before drifting off to sleep was about the other women who would follow in her footsteps. The way she handled situations like tonight's incident would influence how future female SEALs were perceived and treated. The responsibility was enormous, but she had proven once again that she was more than capable of bearing it with honor and distinction. The next morning would bring new challenges and opportunities, but Sarah Martinez had demonstrated that she possessed not only the physical skills necessary for special operations, but also the mental toughness and professional judgment that made her a valuable member of America's most elite fighting force. The 45 seconds in the mess hall had become a defining moment, not just for her career, but for the ongoing evolution of the United States Navy's Special Operations community.